Hi, my name's Joy and I'm here to do a wrap up of the final books I read last year. Thanks for joining me. It's been a little while, it's like the end of January now, but I just want to round off the year with my final reads before I tell you my favourite reads of the year. This is going to be a mixed wrap up again with fiction and non-fiction books. If you're new to the channel, I love to talk about the things I'm reading as well as politics and organising that I do out in the world, and so that influences some of my reading as well. Less so in this wrap up though. This is stuff I read from I think October till the end of the year, and I've actually snuck in 2 books that I only finished in January, but I started them last year, so I kind of want to finish it out altogether. And honestly, let's just get into it. Going by genre like I usually do, I'm starting off with fantasy, although I'm going to sneak in one sci-fi, but that was a reread for me of Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey, and this is the first in the Expanse series, which is a favourite series of mine. I read it a couple years ago and I decided to reread it with my housemate because he's seen the TV show but not read the books. I was really hooked on this the first time. I will say on the reread, I think this is probably the weakest in the series. That's my guess at least, because this book is quite a mystery kind of thriller almost, and so knowing the plot means that it doesn't have as much of the suspense driving you forward. And I would say that the main characters, the narration from Holden and Detective Miller is not quite as good, or like the characters aren't quite as developed at this point. It's kind of set in the future in a universe where humans have colonized the solar system, and so there's 3 main parts of human society. There's like the Earth, Mars, which is kind of run like a military dictatorship, and they have control over most of the resources. And then there is the Belt, which is like an asteroid belt, so like much less secure kind of society and world. And that region is just being used by Mars and Earth to extract resources, so there's not much like sovereignty and autonomy of people in the Belt. So the kind of political struggles is a big theme in the series, which is why I really love it. But with this book, we just start off as a great tragedy unfolds and there's a mystery of a missing girl, and those 2 kind of pieces seem to be tied together, but we don't really know how, we don't know why. The scope of the story expands a lot with the series, so it's really hard to summarize, but this is a really strong start that had me gripped, and even though I gave it 4 stars this time, it is still a world that I really enjoy. I just realized this is actually a sci-fi dystopian category and it's not fantasy at all, because the next 4 books that I read was Sunrise on the Reaping and the Hunger Games trilogy. The Hunger Games was a reread for me, but to start off with, I listened to the audiobook for Sunrise on the Reaping because I was intrigued. I also like Haymitch. I'd heard good things about it, but I've got to say I really didn't enjoy this, unfortunately. I just found it like very fan servicey, and like it didn't really grip me and convince me in the way that the Hunger Games trilogy does, and I really didn't like the writing. I don't know if this is worse because it was the audiobook, like maybe the whole series is a little bit YA, and if I listened to someone narrate it, I wouldn't quite gel with it. But I still stand by my like interpretation that I do think the writing in this one was a bit more annoying and I think the characters were worse. I especially didn't like Haymitch's inner monologue. In comparison, I think the inner perspective of Katniss adds a lot to the Hunger Games series, so I don't know, I think it was something about this book. And something about the pacing and plot didn't work for me either. I think I just couldn't suspend my disbelief, and possibly this is just like age and the fact that this kind of YA book is maybe not my cup of tea anymore, and so maybe I enjoy it in the Hunger Games because of nostalgia, whereas this is new and so I'm being more critical of it. But yeah, I just gave it like 3 stars. I thought it was a very fine YA book, but I didn't feel like it added anything to my experience of the Hunger Games. Anna G gave a review that I found really interesting, talking about how like revolution is portrayed and how like this book in particular adds to the sense that it takes many people and it takes a long time. So I feel like that could be interesting, but unfortunately when I was reading it, I didn't find a lot interesting, like thematically either. So I guess I don't feel strongly about it, and I would still be interested to hear other people's interpretations, but I didn't love it. However, the actual series I really loved. I don't have the first book on me right now. I think the original trilogy really stands up. I gave the first two books 4.5 stars, and then Mockingjay I only gave 3.5. I just love the story and the writing, and yes, nostalgia plays a huge part because I was so attached to the characters. I think honestly also having seen the movies like made it more impactful because I'm quite a visual reader, so I was imagining all the scenes, and for example the reaping scene. I want to share a few thoughts that could be a bit spoilery, like I'm still going to be vague, but sorry if you haven't read it, you can totally skip from here. But character wise, oh my god, seeing like Katniss's relationship with Prim, her protectiveness as an older sister is just so like painful. I also actually really liked the dynamic with Peter. Like I don't have strong opinions about Peter or Gale, to be honest, but I liked the dynamic that the two of them had and how Katniss was kind of responding to him and like how she grew. On this reread, that love triangle felt extra interesting, and there's one part where Gale is like, you're basically going to choose whoever is in pain, and like that made me literally scream out loud because like again, it's the survivor mentality. I actually really love how those relationships play out and how it's like not based on a typical like YA romance. It's like she is quite damaged and like has to go on a journey with that. But anyway, yeah. So there's also one death in Mockingjay that I was really mad about because I felt like the character shouldn't have been where they were. I think I just have to say the spoilers. This is your warning. Finnick's death was so uncalled for. I think he should have stayed at home. He should have stayed with Annie. Why the fuck was he out on this journey? Sure, he wants revenge. I don't buy it. He didn't need to die. But yes, okay, those are all my like emotional thoughts. Things I found interesting more politically and thematically was Snow trying to use Katniss for propaganda and like the co-option of like Katniss and Peter, especially in Catching Fire, I found super interesting. The pre-game events, they cut a lot of it out of the movie, especially for Catching Fire, but I actually think those are the parts of the series I enjoyed the most because you see the like character development and also how the world like is operating, and yeah, the kind of propaganda piece I found really interesting. Also the kind of ethics around the tactics that District 13 uses, like comparing it with like hunting and hunting prey. It's like when you start to dehumanize people to kind of get to the ends that you want, it is dangerous basically. I personally agree with that we should be careful about not furthering a cycle of violence. But I think it's a really complex and interesting conversation, especially when people are trying to liberate themselves from an oppressor. So for me personally, reading it, I think it leaves a lot to think about and isn't too heavy-handed with like moral righteousness of what is right versus wrong. Obviously, Katniss has a viewpoint, but ultimately she isn't the leader of this world. She's just a girl. I think it's okay that the series doesn't really tell us how society is changed and how society has dealt with the revolution and the war and the outcomes. And at the end of the day, I think the series criticizes the top-down approach, but doesn't offer much alternatives or solutions. Personally, reading it, I'm fine with that. I think it's still a really interesting series and still really relevant to the question of like, how do you go up against a system when it's beating you down constantly? And The bit that I found super interesting this time was thinking about the capital actually, and what is the role of the capital in upholding the system, but also in the rebellion. I think it can be easy for a reader to identify with Katniss and think about the politics from the perspective of Katniss and the people in District 12. And in reality, for the average middle-class reader from the global north, like myself, I think there's much more to be gained from seeing ourselves as being a citizen of the capital. Curious if other people have thoughts or have watched different videos and analysis along those lines. But safe to say, I loved rereading it. Let's move on to some literary fiction, starting with So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan, which is a really short novella, like it's really tiny, and I enjoyed this. It follows a man who has recently been broken up with, and he is kind of reflecting on the relationship and also just living his life as it is kind of falling apart. Although it's not so dramatic. It's very mundane, and because it's so short, it's basically just following him over like one day with a few flashbacks. It's a commentary on men in relationships and I guess misogyny and patriarchy. It's kind of just sad. Like, I think it was well done, but it is a bit grim as well. And I ended up just thinking that I wanted to get the perspective of the woman who had broken up with him. Like, why did she stay in the relationship? I think this still has its purpose and like does its job. I'm curious whether like this was written with an intention for men to read it, or like how much men have read this and like discussed this, because it really is just an insight into his head, and I think very accurate in how men think about relationships. I think that makes it a really interesting read, and probably really interesting to discuss. To have the impact that it did with such little writing is really impressive. So I gave it 4 stars. I think it's really good. I listened to the audiobook of On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This book is so beautiful. I think what everyone says about it is true. It's so well written. I really enjoyed the poetic writing, and it goes very like roundabout and is not chronological at all, so it really jumps between different characters and relationships and anecdotes, but is also very reflective. It's from the perspective of this queer Vietnamese boy growing up in America, but written as this very long letter to his mother. The letter part is not very significant. It's more like you're just hearing all these things that he wants to say to her or is reflecting on, about their relationship, about his queerness and his experience being an immigrant. It's quite sad, but I also think it's very human and touching and still kind of captures a lot of the beauty in relationships and in being human together. Listen to what everyone says. Read this book. On a quite different note, I read Fundamentally by Nusayba Yunus. I was so excited to read this because it has a fucking whack summary. It is about an academic, Nadia, who has written about de-radicalizing ISIS brides, and then she gets contacted by the UN to come and actually run a program. But she's come from the world of academia. She actually has no clue what she's doing, and so she kind of gets into the bureaucracy and how the Western world interacts with the Muslim world, and particularly Iraq. And it is kind of based on the author's experiences, because she is an academic who also wrote about this and like worked at a UN agency. Although this book also goes kind of off the rails. She particularly like forms a relationship with one of the young women who reminds her a lot of herself. The back says an exploration of love, family, religion, and the decisions we make in pursuit of belonging. However, as much as I love the concept, I didn't think it was executed super well. It is like a satire, but compared to other similar kind of satirical books I've read, this felt much more unbelievable and kind of over the top. I think it was especially like the dialogue and the characters were really over dramatic. The stuff they say just doesn't feel like real conversations. It's very much kind of there for shock factor. Ones I'm comparing it to in my head is A Case of Exploding Mangoes, and even The Sellout, although I read that a little while ago, so I don't quite remember. But I found, for example, Case of Exploding Mangoes, it was still really funny, and I think the characters don't have to be really well drawn. Like, it's not necessarily about the inner world of the characters, like that's okay. But even if they are sort of symbolic, and even when they're drawn to a bit of an extreme, I think the humor is more that what they're saying and what they're doing represents something funny or ironic about society, or even kind of sad and messed up. It still kind of reveals something about how society works. Whereas this one was just too heavy-handed, and again, I think it was that feeling that things were there for shock factor. So I just have mixed feelings overall. I gave it 3.5 stars. Like, I didn't think it was bad. I still think it's interesting. I feel like talking about these books is just proving how much I want to read other reviews or like other people's thoughts and the sort of commentary around books, because especially with this one, I'm just interested in other perspectives. The final fiction book I read is Sea of Puppies by Amitav Ghosh, which is the one that I finished just recently. But this took me so long to read. It's a historical fiction book and it follows lots of different characters. They end up on a ship owned by a British merchant in India who trades in opium and also slaves or indentured servitude. So mixed up in a lot of shitty business across the British Empire and beyond. But this book is mostly set in India and follows a lot of different Indian characters. I'm just going to read the back. A motley crew of sailors, coolies, and convicts includes a bankrupt Raja, a Chinese opium addict, a Laysom, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, French runaway, and a mulatto freedman from Baltimore. So very different experiences, but I actually also think this kind of does the satire and like social commentary really well, or at least in a way that I enjoyed. Let's just say that. I don't know if you could call it a comedy of manners, but that's what was coming up in my head because the characters are really quite amusing, especially the more privileged ones. Seeing the racial dynamics and caste dynamics was quite interesting, but I felt very attached to some of the other characters who maybe don't have as much agency in their lives, but are making agency, creating that through joining this ship. I think it's really impressive that it covers so many different perspectives and themes about essentially what living under the British Empire looked like at this period of time, which is, I guess, the early 1800s. It is very dense. It uses a lot of old language and very like region-specific language, including in Bhojpuri and Bangla. And I found all of the history really interesting, and I guess I liked how it was written, but sometimes it would go way over the top and there would be like these really long paragraphs of like all the different names for the different types of servants or like the different like kitchen utensils, but in the like anglicized version of Bengali or Hindi. I kind of just skimmed over a lot of it. So I definitely think this is a really hard read and it's not going to be for everyone. I think I found it interesting because I'm interested in this period of history and like didn't know about it, and it was based a lot in Bengal and in Kolkata. So I found that interesting personally, but I don't think it is written super well in that sense. I think there's a way to make it like historically relevant and include a lot of language without including this much, where it like completely breaks down the plot and like the scene to just like list a bunch of things. And I think it creates this atmosphere of like just how ridiculous a lot of the social customs of the time are. It's kind of interesting, but it just made it so slow in some sections and really hard to read sometimes. But at the same time, there are other parts of the book where I really wanted to know what was happening next. And there's a lot of outrageous stuff that happens and like action scenes and drama and suspense. So I didn't find it boring, but I could see how other people would. In the end, I gave it 3.5 stars, and I am interested to continue this series and also read more of his other work. You could say that that kind of South Asian history was a theme for my reading, because now moving on to nonfiction, I read 2 nonfiction books while I was traveling in India, in Bengal, where I'm from, and I've just been finding this so fascinating. I've already talked about a bunch of South Asian nonfiction books I read throughout last year, and I think it's a major part of my life at the moment that I'm exploring, both my personal identity, but also like South Asian diaspora communities and the politics of that, and politics currently going on in South Asia. So these next 2 are a little bit niche, but I really appreciated reading them. First we have History of Bangladesh. This one also I only finished in January, but it was like a very long, slow read while I was traveling, and then when I came home. This is by Willem van Schendel, who is a Dutch, I think, academic, but this book is not academic at all. It's very accessible and easy to read, and it's basically an overview of like the entire history of the Bangladesh region. And it really starts from like the history of settlement in the region. Like the first section is about the geography and ecology of this region and how that's impacted human life, and like early civilizations even. Not in a lot of detail, but I really loved how that was a theme, and it comes, starts so early, and then it covers like the Mughal Empire and the British colonial empire, and when Bangladesh was part of Pakistan as like East Pakistan, and then the formation of the modern state of Bangladesh. It doesn't go into a lot of details, but it really just covered everything that I wanted to know, and it gave me so much further reading. It's actually very similar to a book that I read much earlier called Shadows at Noon. I heard about this book through the footnotes of that one, so I guess it makes sense, because it just gave me a really solid grounding. Now I can explore different themes and topics that I'm more interested in. I think it was really easy to read. There were some like case studies and stories that I really appreciated, and lots of images. I would have liked a bit more from the sections around culture, but I think what was there did feel a little bit biased, and like it was from an outsider perspective, and you could really tell that this guy is not from Bangladesh and he's, European. So I guess that's fine, because I don't totally trust his narration. I think that's the only like criticism I have, if you can call it that. Like it was fine. I knew what I was getting into. Like I wasn't coming in looking for fantastic analysis. I just kind of wanted some straight facts. I think the most interesting theme that I took away from this was how Bengal is a very stratified society and has been for a very long time, particularly the rural agrarian kind of relationships between people, and like the kind of class dynamics that have existed. There's lots and lots of layers or like tiers, and yes, caste is an influence, but the Mughal Empire and the British also really cemented these different kind of systems, class systems or social structures. But that's just one thing that I found interesting. Like I said, there was so much in this book. I took many, many notes. The other book I read is very academic, which is Bengal Divided, Hindu Communalism and Partition by Joya Chatterjee. She's the author of Shadows at Noon, but this is like one of her very academic texts. This book, like, I'm not gonna say blew my mind, but it really like clicked so many things into place for me, because it basically explores the political dynamics within Bengal that led to the way partition happened. At the start of the book, it explains that there was a proposal from the British to partition Bengal into East Bengal and West Bengal in 1905. So this is before independence was really on the cards. And at that time, there was a huge backlash and an entire movement against this partition that was really linked to the independence movement and like freedom fighters and all of this mythology that is really core to like how especially Bengalis talk about history, especially Indian Bengalis specifically. But within 30 years, the same groups of people were advocating for and wanting a partition of Bengal based on, I guess, like Muslim majority and Hindu majority areas. So this looks at the ideas behind nationalism and Bengal identity, the analysis of the political elite and how they basically prioritize their class interests, to keep their wealth, keep owning land, and keep political power in these new nations that were being formed. How much that contributed to the like communalism kind of being like the Hindu identity versus a Muslim identity, and the friction between those kind of groupings in society, in Bengali society specifically. So yes, I found it fascinating. It goes into so much detail and like all the little bits of research I really loved. It was exactly what I wanted. Totally would not recommend this as general reading, but I'm so excited to like talk about and process all of this information. Again, connecting a lot of it to my personal history and being able to place like my family's history, and like, you know, most of my family migrated through this time period from East Bengal and what is now Bangladesh to India. It also really proved how much the Indian National Congress sucks. I hate the Congress. They fucking suck. I read this a bit after Zoran Mamdani was elected, and he like quoted Nehru, who's one of the prime ministers and part of the Indian Congress. And I had an immediate reaction when I heard that. I was like, that's an interesting political figure to be calling back to. And I stand by that now. I'm like, oh my God, why did you make that decision? I understand why. Obviously, people care a lot about Nehru. I just think that political literacy about South Asia is really poor. And there's so much propaganda coming from the Indian government, also Bangladesh, like from opposing sides. I just appreciate this analysis. I want to read everything Joy Chatterjee has written and just keep going down these little rabbit holes. The final non-fiction book I have is Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. And I really, really loved this. Tyson draws links between different Aboriginal cultures and conversations really that he has with people from all around the continent to try to explain some of the core parts of an Indigenous way of thinking about the world, and looking at some of the big questions of the world about how we should kind of function in society and how we relate to other people and to the land from an Indigenous pedagogy, I guess. But I don't even know how to describe this book, because I think it breaks the format of like a non-fiction, an English non-fiction book, I guess. Aboriginal cultures are grounded in oral communication, and also through images and symbols. So he's trying to translate a lot of ideas and conversations that aren't really meant to be written down, or written down in the form of like a typical non-fiction book. And I think he does it really well. Like, I think this is a really transformative kind of book. It's really trying to get you to see the world through different eyes as well, and take on some of the Indigenous ways of looking at the world. I'm going to leave it at that for now, because as a little sneak peek, this is going to end up in my favorite books of 2025. So I want to go through my notes a little bit more and figure out what to share, because I could talk about a lot of the ideas in this endlessly, but I'll come to you with a clearer discussion in my best books of 2025 video. But safe to say that this is really, really good, and I really recommend it to everyone. Now I have to go back because there is one romance book that I forgot to tell you about, which was If I Never Met You by Varia McFarlane. I listened to it on audiobook. I've read a bunch of her books by now. I would say they are very British, quite funny, and follow interesting and quite strong-willed female main characters, and usually they don't focus entirely on the romance. There's like more going on in particularly the female main character's life. In this one, the main character's long-term boyfriend, who she's been with since college and they're now in their 30s, he breaks up with her, and it is very dramatic and leaves her completely in the lurch. And then she ends up doing this fake dating thing with someone in her workplace. He seems like a bit of a player, but obviously they get to know each other, and she's finding her sense of self after leaving this relationship and the life that she had planned out with him. So I really liked the perspective of an older woman and like coming out of a long-term relationship, looking at the world and men and dating with new eyes. I thought it was interesting and fun, but I honestly can't remember much about it. It was a 3-star read and not my favorite of hers, but it fulfilled its purpose of just being like an easy thing I could listen to on audiobook. Hey, I don't know which video this was gonna go in, but I wanted to do a little book haul because I went out to buy some birthday gifts at a bookshop, and I ended up stopping at a bunch of op shops and coming home with like, I don't know how many this is, more than 10 books. I found book 4 and 5 of the Expanse series. I've been slowly collecting the series from op shops and having surprising luck with it actually. I then also got another well, actually I don't know if this is sci-fi or fantasy, but it's called Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and I honestly don't remember much about it, but I remember hearing about it on BookTube, and I don't know, it was one of the books that I think was like, that seems interesting, but not enough that I'm going to prioritize reading it. So I just kind of thought it is a fun thing to earn from the bookstore for the op shop for a couple dollars. And then I have 2 books that were actually books I read in high school that I remember being good, so I thought it would be fun to earn. They were a bit impulse. This is Passenger by Alexandra Bracken, and I also don't remember much about this. It's historical fiction, a bit of time travel it seems like, maybe a romance. I remember having like good vibes around it, and then I looked it up and saw some positive reviews, including from Anna G, who I trust. But the other one I'm way more excited about, which was Grasshopper Jungle. You can't see the title very well. And this is Andrew Smith, and this was one of my favorites the year that I read it. Like, I remember being like, this is one of my new favorite books. And what I remember about it is there's like an apocalyptic scenario where people are turning into grasshoppers, which means that they want to have sex and then eat each other, something like that. And our main character is kind of like surviving this situation, and he's like kind of trapped with his ex-girlfriend and his best friend, and he's having like a love triangle situation and like bisexual awakening slash crisis. And I remember it being really funny, and I'm really interested in rereading this. There's a few high school favorites that I have wanted to reread for a while and been like, that would be an interesting vlog, because I have no idea if I will enjoy this humor now. The next one that I got from the op shops was Son of Sin by Omar Sacco, and he's a poet who I've been wanting to check out for a long time. I was recommended by Olivia from Olivia's Catastrophe, and he's like a queer Arab poet from Australia, from Sydney, and I think he also like ran for the Greens or something in the last election. Anyway, so I've been very interested by him, and I read one of his short stories in a collection last year, was it? Or the year before? I didn't love the collection or that story in particular, but I think I'm still mostly excited to check out the poetry. This one is like a fiction book, and I also don't know what it's about, but yeah, again, I'm interested. Moving on to the books that I bought new from the paperback bookshop. I got myself a copy of The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley because, spoiler maybe, that this is one of my favorite books of 2025. I haven't been buying many books that I've actually read. Like, I feel like most of the books I've been buying recently were either nonfiction that I haven't read, or just books from like an op shop that I'm interested in and I wouldn't buy them new, so I get them secondhand. But it's kind of nice to have a collection of books you really enjoy. I have 2 gifts actually, which I don't have with me. I gifted my friend a copy of The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri because I read that also like last year and really enjoyed it, and it's about a Bengali family in America, and I gave it to my Bengali family friend. I just thought that she would like it. And I also gifted a copy of Communion, I think that was what it's called, by Bell Hooks. This was just kind of based on conversations that I've been having with that friend about like love and friendships and being in the patriarchy and not having a lot of trust in men. And Anyway, I haven't read this book. I did like All About Love, so I like Bell Hooks's ideas. So I just thought it would be really interesting, and I just want to continue that conversation. So those are the two books I gifted. I picked up one more new book for myself, which was Amitav Ghosh, The Nutmeg's Curse, which is Parables for a Planet in Crisis. He has another book about climate change released earlier called The Great Derangement. It just seems like a lot of themes that I'm interested in from a South Asian perspective, particularly like it reminds me a little bit of Braining Sweetgrass almost, like in the sense of the parable. Like I feel like he's going to be talking about folk stories and talking about like overconsumption and kind of exploitation of land as this kind of central theme, how that's tied to capitalism. Yeah, I'm just interested in this perspective, and honestly, probably the cover did really convince me on this one because I think it's quite pretty. I actually do have a couple more non-fictions. These ones are a bit random. Basically, we went to like our neighbors to give them little like Christmas cookies, holiday cookies, whatever, and talk to them a bit. And one of our neighbors works in like domestic violence, and he gave us 2 books, which is quite random, I guess. But this is Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates, who I think has just come out with a new book I have been hearing about called The New Age of Sexism, which is kind of about AI and like patriarchy and male violence. And yeah, anyway, so I guess she's probably a prominent person, but I've never heard of this book. And See What You Made Me Do, I actually don't know anything about. So yeah, I don't know if I'll pick these books up. Seem like very heavy reading. And as much as I think it's interesting, I don't know if I'm going to commit to like reading an entire book on these topics, but it was really sweet that he gave them to us. The last book I got was No Friend But the Mountains by Behrooz Bukhani, and this was written from the like refugee detention center on Manus Island, which is one of the most horrible pieces of Australian policy that is, I mean, ongoing. I actually don't know exactly what's happening on Manus Island right now, but offshore detention is an ongoing issue. And Behrooz is a journalist, and he's continued to like be an advocate and writer after, I guess, being released from Manus Island. So I've heard a bit about him, and I've heard really good things about this book in particular and it being well written. That's my little haul. Thank you for joining me. I really somehow thought that this wrap up would again be short, but it never is. So thank you for watching this whole video. Let me know what you thought, if you've read any of these books or if you're interested in any of the conversations that I brought up. I love to go on my rambles, and I would love it if you also rambled in the comments. Tell me what you're thinking. As always, take care of yourself and each other, and bye for now.